Hello, and welcome to episode 31 of A Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. My name is Ed Hill, and this is the podcast dedicated to the journals of my great-great-grandfather, William Mowbray Scott, written way back in the 1840s. So if you're tuning in again, thanks very much for doing so, and if this is the first time you've heard the podcast, I hope you're going to enjoy it. Why not tell all your friends and listen to all the previous episodes as well? Or listen to all the previous episodes and then tell all your friends. Just tell your friends. I just thought I'd try and say a few quick things in the introduction. I'll just begin by saying where we were at the end of the last episode in following William and his family. So they're travelling back from Italy, where he'd been the train driver on the first railway in Milan. And they were going over the Splugan Pass, which is was the main route, or one of the main routes between Italy and Switzerland over the Alps. So they got pretty well up to the top of it, and they were just about to enter Switzerland. So that's where we've got to. They'd come up via Milan through Como, and then up to Chiavenna to the Splugan Pass. And basically at the beginning of this one, their journey continues down the other side of the Alps into Switzerland, and then they travel up through Switzerland, following the Rhine and going along the various lakes that are on the main route up into Germany. Now, I just thought I'd say one thing that did strike me, because I was doing research about the Splugan Pass. There's quite a few of these videos on YouTube of people, normally on motorbikes, going over these various alpine passes, demonstrating their motorbike riding ability, but also sort of showing you how nice the scenery is and everything. So I was watching one of those, and of course the guy does it in about 20 minutes, I think he goes over the Splugan Pass. For William and his family, in the day of the horse and carts, it would have been a whole day's journey, maybe running into 2 days. So I don't know, it just really struck me how radical that change is really in the ability we have now to travel quickly. Actually, the Splugan Pass, I think for probably about 6 months of the year, you can't actually drive over it because it's full of snow. But that didn't stop them in the 19th century. They were made of sterner stuff. A little bit of snow, god damn it, we're still going to get over it. It just kind of made me think, as I sat there in the comfort of my office chair, watching this motorcyclist zoom up the twists and turns of the Splugan Pass, you lose a sense of how really dangerous and intrepid a journey it would have been in William's time. Regarding the podcast itself, it's available on all good podcast platforms, so if you just Google it, it will come up. Or you could try Bing and try its AI-enhanced search engine. And if you say, find the Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad, it comes up with the most marvellous description of the podcast. Far better than I could say. I was really quite chuffed with it, really. I shall have to get automated bots to do all my PR in future. If you want to get in contact with me about the podcast, there's several social media ways. There's a Twitter account, Scots of the Historic, and that's at 3G Grand Tour. That's the number 3, and then it's G Grand Tour. That's quite an easy way to make any comments or observations about the podcast, or you can message me directly there if you want. There's also the Facebook page, which is at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. Again, that's another way to contact me. And there's also a Mastodon account. Hasn't really taken off Mastodon, has it? I've got to say, unfortunately. It did seem like it was going at one point to eclipse Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it these days. But no doubt something perhaps more interesting and more civilised than Twitter will come along one day. Or maybe we'll just reject social media completely. Another thing while I'm at it, I should just quickly apologise for some of my mispronunciations in a previous episode. As I said at the time, There's a lot of different ways of saying various place names in this area of northern Italy stroke Switzerland. So you have the Italian version, the German version, the French version, and even the Romansh version. And even within Romansh, you've got more local dialects as well. Anyway, I was trying to say it, I think, in the German pronounced way about the town of Chur, and I kept calling it Chur. Of course, it's spelt Chur, but in German you say Chur. So I do apologise. Of course, in French it's Chur. And then I think another one is Chur and Chur and Chur. But it's certainly not Chur anyway, which was what I kept saying. So apologies for that. So I just now say a little bit about this next episode. So William's continuing his journey and they're going through Switzerland. They're mainly doing it by diligence or stagecoach. They're making their way towards Germany or towards Baden. Similarly to Italy, Germany wasn't unified at this point, so there's still the individual states like Prussia and Saxony and Baden and things like that at this point in time. So there's not a unified Germany in which to cross the border into. I think that's it really for this intro. It does begin with William's descent and his family's descent down the Splugan Pass, which, as you'll hear, is a bit dicey. The Austrian government are pretty particular who they let into their territories, and they are quite as particular who they let out. At 1 o'clock we reached the summit, and began rapidly to descend. Cold at this time was dreadfully piercing, the snow laying on the ground to the depth of 10 and 12 feet, and a drizzling sleet falling at the same time. Tedious as the ascent may be, there is not anything like the danger there is in descending. The least false step of the horse, or the breaking of the reins or traces, and you are hurled to the bottom of the precipice in a moment. When we had nearly reached the bottom, the horse that drew our sledge lost his footing, and it was only through the coolness and nerve of the driver that he regained it. The moment he saw the animal slip, he sprung from the back of the sledge, on which he was standing at some distance, and bearing himself amongst the snow, acted as a drag against him, the horse sliding on his hind quarters for upwards of 200 yards. Fortunately, in a few moments after this occurrence, all the danger was over, and we had the unspeakable gratification of viewing the village of Splugan, and where an excellent dinner was awaiting us, to which we did ample justice. After stopping here an hour, we entered a larger sledge, to which 2 horses were attached, and proceeded at a rapid rate along the banks of the river Rhine, which here is merely a brawling mountain torrent, the road laying considerably on the descent. On both sides of us was vast quantities of timber, but not of large size, and we passed numerous sawmills on our route. We passed through the villages of Thal and Platz, and in about 2 hours after leaving Splugan, we arrived at Thusis, a town of some size, and exchanged the sledge for the diligence. The scenery now formed quite a different character. The country was thickly populated, and the ground well cultivated. Large and comfortable farmhouses were seen in all directions, and of the fields, houses, and villages, they reminded me much of England. In some parts we passed through narrow and gloomy valleys, crossing the Rhine repeatedly by lofty bridges. In many instances these valleys contain a scenery of a noble and sublime character. On one hand immense and towering rocks, frequently overhanging the road, appearing to threaten the traveller with destruction. On the other a deep black and foaming gulf, the river brawling at the bottom, and the banks clothed with pines of an enormous size. In many parts also the rocks approach so close to the river that galleries are pierced through them to allow passage. The country is alternately fertile plains and those deep valleys, continued all the way to Coire, which is a place we reached at 9 in the evening. Coire, pronounced Cora, is the capital of the canton of the Grisons, and is a bishopsy. It is surrounded by ancient brick walls, with square and round towers. It is divided into 2 distinct parts, the least of which is the Catholic, and the greater part of that the Protestants. At this place the French surprised and defeated the Austrian army with great slaughter in 1799. It is seated between 2 mountains on the navigable river Plessur, which makes Coire a place of great traffic. It was the birthplace of Angelica Kauffmann, the celebrated female painter. So she lived from 1741 to 1807 and apparently was a founder member of the Royal Academy. Coire is 22 leagues south by west of Constance, population 12,000. The canton of the Grisons, through which we had been travelling after leaving Lombardy, is the largest in Switzerland. It is bounded on the north by Glarus, St. Gall and the Vorarlberg, east by the Tyrol, south by the Valtellina, Milan and the canton of Ticino, west by the Uri. The Grison Alps arise 11,000 feet above the level of the sea, and the line of perpetual snow is from 8,200 to 8,400 feet. The lowest point of the populous valley, Engadin, at Martinsbruck, is 3,234 feet above the level of the sea, and the highest village is situated at an elevation of 5,600 feet. The varieties of the climate are therefore very striking in the Grisons. This country is divided into 5 great valleys: the valley of the posterior Rhine, which includes the Rheinwald, and the valleys of Schamser, or Shams, and the Via Mala, and the Domleschg. The latter is formed by the posterior Rhine and is the mildest district of the Grisons. The language spoken here is a mixture of German, Latin and Italian, what we would call Romansh. The Schamser Valley contains several villages. Between this and the Rheinwald is the terrible Via Mala. This translated sort of means bad path in Romansh, and it's a notoriously difficult pathway and passage through this bit of the Alps. The terrible Via Mala, which is formed by the posterior Rhine. In this and in the Rheinwald, the winter lasts 9 months on account of their elevated situations. 2 formidable roads lead to Italy, one over the Splugan and the other over the St. Bernard. The former was passed in 1800 by the French under Etienne MacDonald. Claude Lecourbe, with a considerable force, ventured to enter the latter in 1797. Etienne MacDonald, he was basically a French general of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars era. His name MacDonald is because his history was linked to the Jacobites, actually. So his father was an exile from the Jacobite uprising in the UK, but Etienne himself grew up in France. And you could describe him as a career general. He spent most of his life in the military, but he did, after some initial mistrust, become a faithful and loyal member of Napoleon's high-ranking military officers. And Napoleon instructed him to lead several military actions during his time. But he's noted, actually, for the success that he had while he was in charge of campaigns in the Switzerland area. Apparently, because his family origins go back to the island of Uist in Scotland, there's actually a plaque there that was unveiled in 2010 to his honour, so there's still that connection there. Similarly, Claude Lecourbe was another general of this era, again spanning both the French Revolutionary Wars and then subsequently serving under Napoleon. So he also served in the Swiss area of Europe as well. So when France was carrying out its wars to acquire Switzerland, I suppose is how you describe it, he was another general who had various victories in this area at that time. And again, he seems to have been one of Napoleon's more respected generals as well. He was a friend of Jean-Victor Moreau, who was another French general who served at the time of Napoleon, but in fact he became actually a rival of Napoleon's and was banished to the United States. And because Lecourbe was friends with him and defended him, Napoleon fell out with him. But it seems he later must have forgiven him, because when Napoleon came back for the 100 Days campaign, he was employed by Napoleon as a general again. So obviously the slight didn't last long for Napoleon. The second valley is that of the anterior Rhine, which extends from the western frontier and the St. Gotthard to Coire and Lucianstag. Here are the most interesting points: the old Benedictine Abbey of De Sentis, whose literary treasures and buildings were destroyed in 1799 by the French. Also Elanthe, the principal town, where Roman antiquities and coins are found in great abundance. The third valley is that of the Engadin, or the Valley of the Upper Inn, which stretches from southwest to northeast and contains indeed no important town, but incomparable views and picturesque scenery, being one of the most romantic spots in the whole chain. The fourth valley is formed by the Albala River, which rises in the Julian Mountains and falls into the posterior Rhine at Tufsis. The fifth valley is that of Prattigau, situated on the northern frontier in the neighbourhood of the Württemberg, Mayenfeld being the principal town. The inhabitants of the Grisons are divided into 3 leagues: the League of God's House, the capital of which is Coire, the Grey League with Elance, and the League of the 10 Jurisdictions, of which Davos is considered as the principal place. In these 3 places, 63 deputies of the leagues assemble annually in September, under 3 heads, deliberate on the affairs of the canton, and decide finally in legal cases. The canton sends 1,600 men to the army of the Confederacy and contributes 12,000 guilders. About 2/3 of the inhabitants profess the Helvetica Protestant religion, but the ministers have so scanty an income that they are obliged to maintain themselves by their industry. About 10,000 of the inhabitants speak the Italian dialect. These are the Engadin. About 28,000 the Swiss dialect of the German, and more than 36,000, chiefly near the sources of the Rhine, speak the Romanche. Commerce is much interrupted by the narrowness of the passes on the frontiers. The exports are cattle, cheese, coal, and rare minerals, for which grain, salt, linen, and cloth are received in return. Okay, going to stop at this point to say a few things about this section of the journal. Firstly, sounds like they had a pretty treacherous trip down the Splugan Pass, as William describes it, with the horse slipping on its hind legs for, I think it says 200 yards or something like that. It does demonstrate how, before the time of the various tunnels through the Alps were constructed, how dangerous and how difficult it was to travel between Italy and France and Italy and Switzerland and so forth. So the economic benefits of better communications through tunnels and bridges is enormous when you think of it. Good job William didn't meet his end there, I think. And the illustration of the Splugan Pass with the horses on the sleds, it does look pretty dangerous, I must say. So I just thought I'd mention the few things after that. So they go to Tufsis and then they're at Coire. Like I mentioned, many of these names are all transferable into French, Italian, German and Romanche. Cour in German, C-H-U-R, Cour, or Coire in French. Anyway, that's the first big town that they come to after Tufsis. Now, that's actually the oldest town, apparently, in Switzerland, or settlement, and its history dates back 5,000 years. There's only a small part of the central old town existing today, and much of the walls that William mentions, there's not that much of it left from what I can see. It sounds like quite an interesting place to visit if you're in Switzerland and wanting to find somewhere perhaps not an obvious tourist attraction, but obviously its history through the years is because of its location on this route near the Alps. So Google it if you kind of want to know the whole history of it. I won't go into all that, but I will just touch on this artist who was born there, Angelika Kaufmann. I was ignorant of her existence before I read about her, but if you're an art historian, you may well have heard of her. She was a founder member of the Royal Academy in London, along with a lady called, I think, Mary Moser. So it's interesting, when it was formed, there were these 2 female artists who were signatories to the founding of the Royal Academy in London in 1768, I think it was. But she was a very talented artist. She was born in Switzerland, in Chur, in 1741. Her father was an artist, so she's almost like an artistic version of Mozart, I think. She was very soon identified as being a bit of a prodigy, very talented youngster. And she was actually, even by the age of 12, she was painting important people in Switzerland, you know, noblemen and bishops and things like that. So her talent as an artist was very soon recognised. Apparently she was also a very, very good singer as well, and she could have been an opera singer. So she had this choice she had to make early on in life, whether she wanted to be a painter or an opera singer. But she chose painting and could speak many languages. She learned them quite young in age, so she could speak French, German, and English and Italian. And she seemed to mix in these artistic echelons in Europe. Her connection with the UK really started. She met some, I suppose you'd call them expats in Rome, and she got to know them, and then she was invited over to the UK. And the first notable person she painted in the UK was the actor David Garrick, and that was a successful artwork that she did and made a name a bit. And then, she was invited to paint many more people in England, and she lived in London for a while. It was a sort of slightly curious incident in her life. She married a man called Count Frederick de Horn in 1767, I think it was. But it turned out not only was he probably not a count, but he was probably a bigamist, and turned out to be a right wrong 'un, as they say. He wasn't who he claimed to be. Basically, he was an imposter who sort of duped her into marrying him. Anyway, it soon was discovered, really, that he wasn't who he thought to be. He thought he might have been an illegitimate son of a Swedish nobleman. But anyway, what quickly happened was that he was basically paid off by Angelica's father to divorce her, I suppose, and separate from her. And he went off and died in obscurity, really. She was also very good friends with the artist Joshua Reynolds as well, who was much older than her. And I think he used to call her Miss Angel, Angelica Miss Angel or something. I think maybe there was a sort of infatuation there, but I don't know. You can't say there was anything inappropriate going on. But she then moved back to Italy, and she established herself in her time as a well-known artist. So it was funny because, I mentioned in a previous episode when William had been in the gallery in Milan and he'd been observing this woman copying the artworks on the walls there. And, I said, perhaps you don't hear of female artists of this era. I mean, Angelica Kauffmann obviously was a real trailblazer in her time. In fact, I think it said somewhere I read there weren't any more female members of the Royal Academy until about 1930. So more than 100 years after she'd been a founder member. I suppose this is the thing. If you've got the right connections, you become notable in a way, don't you? Just because she was mixing in that art world and aristocratic world. And perhaps the poor lady who was copying art in Milan in the gallery there, she might well have been as gifted as Angelica Kauffmann, but perhaps she didn't have the right connections to get known as an artist. Definitely worth looking her up. She did marry an Italian artist called Antonio Zucchi after the failed marriage with this Count Frederick de Horn. And she did move back to Rome then and continued her work as an artist. There's rather a nice painting that she did of herself. It's a sort of self-portrait. And I mentioned this thing about she could have been a singer or she could have been an artist. And it's her in the middle between these two female representations of music on the one hand, who's got a notebook of a musical score in her hand, and then art on the other, who's got a paintbrush in her hand and an artist's palette with all the colours on it. And so it's just a nice picture of her trying to decide, which way she should go with music or is it with art. I think it's actually in a gallery in Yorkshire, maybe, that work. So that was her. And just one more thing to say about Cora and well-known artists. The famous H.R. Geiger, who did all the designs for the alien in the film Alien, came up with the inspiration for that fearsome creature. He was born in Cora. And in fact, apparently there is a cafe dedicated to the Alien films there that you can go to and visit. So Angelica Kauffmann may have been one of the first artists well known and linked to Cora, but H.R. Geiger is one of the more recent ones because it's where he was born too. Just very briefly talk about the Via Mala Gorge. It's this very, very narrow gorge that it was formed by water just continually eroding this area of the Alps. And the passage dates back to Roman times, and mule drivers could use it because it was a quick way to get to the Splugan Pass by going up this very, very treacherous gorge with mules. But it was notoriously dangerous and you could slip and fall down into the gorge. But now it's become quite a big tourist attraction in Switzerland. So if you visit the Via Mala Gorge, there's a stairway that takes you all the way down to where the river flows, and you can see how the water has eroded the rocks either side and created these sort of interesting shapes and everything. But even by William's time, I don't think it was really being used very much as a serious way of getting goods and people across the Alps, because it was pretty dangerous. And lastly, I thought it'd be useful just to explain a little bit about the history of the governments of Switzerland, just to give you an idea of some of the things William's referring to, because at this time it was known as the Swiss Confederacy, and the various cantons of Switzerland had always been sort of independent states, really. They were much more self-governing as areas of Switzerland than, say, like counties are in the UK. They were their own little kind of kingdoms. But the Confederacy came together. It was a kind of organisation of cantons that, for whatever reason, began to form what was called the Swiss Confederacy. Now, not that much earlier than when William's there. When the French Revolution had happened and the French Revolutionary Wars happened, France effectively invaded Switzerland, and it tried to create a more unified country called the Helvetic Republic. That's not to be confused with the typeface Helvetica, although that was invented by a Swiss person, so that's why it's got that name, I suppose. The Helvetii were the inhabitants of the area of Switzerland in Roman times. So that's why the prefix Hel is used for quite a few Swiss-related things like Helvetica, Helvetia, which is the Swiss national female symbol, a bit like Britannica is to the UK, I suppose. Anyway, the Helvetic Republic was an attempt by France to unify Switzerland in a more coherent manner, really. And this was extremely unpopular because there was this long history of independence amongst the cantons in Switzerland. So this was really not liked by the local residents. And some of the cantons, as William mentions, they break down into Protestant areas and Catholic areas. But Switzerland is very, very intermingled with Protestants and Catholics as well. Most cantons would have a majority Catholic and then a minority Protestant population, and vice versa. So the cantons, for various historical reasons, existed as these little kingdoms, really, and formed the Swiss Confederacy. But as I was saying, the French tried to kind of unify it in a more coherent governed state. But even Napoleon, in the end, had to acquiesce, and he returned Switzerland back to its confederacy-type status. So that's why when William's talking about these various cantons, like the Grisons and St. Gallen and stuff like that, so, they're quite strongly independent states as you go through Switzerland. And maybe in William's time there was almost more of a sense of going from one country to another, or one canton to another, as he describes it. And also there's this idea, which he mentions, the various cantons contributing to a national state, supplying so many soldiers to the Swiss Confederacy's army, as it were. I don't think I've really explained that very well, but if you look up the history of Switzerland, it is very complicated. It's also been strongly independent for many years. I've actually gone to Switzerland quite often in my lifetime for various reasons. And I suppose, like everything, communications has made everything smaller, and these sort of local differences are probably less apparent these days than they were at one time. Palm Sunday, March 20th. Left Quarry at 5 in the morning. Considerable snow on the ground, and the streets were wet and sloppy. We passed through the following villages on our route: Trimis, Sizers, Meinfeld, Sargens and Berchis. These were all pretty large and populous, the houses chiefly of wood, but substantially built and apparently warm and comfortable. The churches were of the same material, and most of them boasting a spire with a gilded weathercock on the top. The gardens and orchards were very numerous, and well stocked with vegetables and fruit trees. At 10 o'clock we were brought to a dead standstill, as the road suddenly terminated at the foot of a lofty mountain. I looked to the right, nothing but a large swamp. I looked to the left. There I could see nothing but immense piles of timber, with narrow passages betwixt them. As they commenced taking the horses from the diligence, a man hoisted one of my trunks on his shoulders, and marched off through one of the narrow openings betwixt the timber. I determined to follow, and emerging from the vast piles of the former giants of the forest, I found that we was on the banks of a considerable lake, on whose surface our journey was to be continued. This was the lake of Wallenstadt, or the Walensee. We then entered a large covered boat, propelled by oars and a sail. This lake is 10 miles in length and 2 in breadth. On one side the rocks were perpendicular to the most wonderful height, and are broken in many places into the most fantastic forms. In some places representing churches, ruined castles and other buildings. About halfway down the lake, a most splendid waterfall presents itself, pouring forth an immense body of water from a vast height. On the opposite side of the lake, the mountains, though lofty, are not so precipitous, and are well clothed with wood to their very summits. Several small villages are situated at their foot, and close to the water's edge. I certainly do think that of all the various places I have seen, that for sublimity and grandeur of scenery, this lake has no equal. The town of Wallenstadt lays at the east end of the lake, and is a place of great thoroughfare for merchandise from Germany through the Grisons to Italy, and is situated in the canton of St. Gall. Wallenstadt is 12 leagues northwest of Quarry. The canton of St. Gall consists principally of estates belonging to the ancient monastery of that name. The general appearance of this canton is covered with lofty mountains. The valleys are, however, extremely beautiful and fruitful in the greatest degree, producing corn, wine, flax, hemp, etc., in great abundance. This canton is also well known on account of the excellence and extent of its manufacturers, which are considered to almost rival those of our own country. The population amounts to 145,000 persons. The canton is divided into 8 districts, and furnishes 2,630 men to the Swiss Confederacy, and £2,500 per annum. We arrived at the lower end of the lake at 1 o'clock, and found a neat inn close by the water's edge, and a great many small craft which ply on the lake were also moored here. Amongst them rested a neat little steamboat, used for making passages, but at that time undergoing repairs. Right, I thought I'd stop at this point just to say a few things about the Walensee, or Lake Wallenstadt, that William is traversing with his family on this sailboat. As he describes the dimensions of it, it's quite a long and thin lake in Switzerland. It spans 2 cantons, I think, actually, St. Gallen and the canton of Glarus. It was a major route to travel this way over the Walensee. It was called Lake Wallenstadt because Wallenstadt is the town at the end of the lake, which William, as you have heard, gets to. And Wallenstadt itself these days isn't a very large town, but in my research I did come up with a couple of interesting associations with it. About this time, Franz Liszt, the very famous pianist and composer, was travelling around this area of Switzerland as well, and he wrote a little piece of music called O Lac de Wallenstadt, which was inspired by the lake. This is part of a series of compositions that he did inspired by his tours of this bit of Europe at that time. He was actually travelling with his mistress, who was Merida Ogolt. Although they had children, they never married because she couldn't get a certified annulment of her marriage from the Catholic Church from her first husband. So Franz Liszt and her never married, and actually he left her anyway a few years later, but they did have 3 children together. But writing about this tune that he wrote, inspired by the Walensee, she said, "Franz wrote me there a melancholy harmony, imitative of the sigh of the waves and the cadence of the oars, which I've never been able to hear without weeping." I would actually try and look it up. It's called O Lac de Wallenstadt, and it is actually a very nice little piece of music. It was part of a wider composition of music that Liszt did called Année de Pèlerinage, or the Years of Pilgrimage. At this time, Franz Liszt, he decided to become a really top pianist. He was, I think, inspired by the violinist Paganini. So at the height of his performance powers, it was this thing called Listomania. And it was really like an early form of fan worship that we would recognise today with pop stars and rock stars and mad fans and groupies. You know, there were stories of women fighting one another over his handkerchiefs and trying to get hold of his spent coffee grounds and things like this. You could sort of understand why. He was quite a striking-looking person. You know, he was handsome, I suppose you'd say, when he was in his younger years. And he put in quite flamboyant performances when he was performing at the piano. So you can kind of see why he did attract this early rock-style stardom. Does that work? Rock-style stardom. Quite hard to say. Pop-style stardom. The really only reason I mention it is because it's pretty well contemporary with when William was travelling around this bit of Switzerland as well. So, you know, it's a very similar time frame. Going on to Wallenstedt itself, it's not a very big town. In fact, when I was looking through the demographics of it, it was sort of showing the breakdown of people from various ethnic backgrounds from around the world, you know, and you are talking sometimes in less than hundreds of people. So, you know, it's not a big town. But there is an interesting monument there called the Peace Monument, or Paxmal, which was the life's work of this artist called Carl Bickel. It's sort of set in the mountains overlooking the lake, and it's this sort of neoclassical structure with a Greek-like temple at one end, and either side there are these, all made of stone, bas-reliefs, as William would have said, and on one side it depicts the physical life, and on the other side it depicts the spiritual life. And Carl Bickel started building this thing in 1924 and finally finished it in 1949. Can't help thinking there's something slightly ironic about the fact that near his completion of this monument to peace, the Second World War was going on around the rest of Europe. I mean, it's a beautiful location and it's a beautiful building and monument. So if you ever happen to be in this area of Switzerland, I would suggest going to see it, because it's a lovely place of contemplation. And it's got these beautiful mosaics on the walls as well, in the temple bit of it, of nature and representative figures of aspects of life. But yeah, just struck me that it was being built literally when bombs were falling and there was terrible destruction and war going on around the rest of the continent. Unfortunately, I think Carl Bickel started it because of the First World War. But unfortunately, the second one came along not that long after. But it's a one-man completed thing, and it is beautiful. I think it's located on some sort of ley line type thing as well, emitting its spiritual peacefulness that oozes through the walls of it. Anyway, the next thing I wanted to talk about, again, it's just through the sort of research doing this. William mentions when they get to Wallenstedt at the other end of the lake, he mentions what he says is a nice little steamer. And I'm pretty certain that this was actually a steamboat called Minerva, and this was actually the first paddle steamer to operate on Lake Zurich. But actually at this time there was a period when it was moved from Lake Zurich, because you could get along through the connecting rivers from Lake Zurich to the Walensee, or Lake Wallenstedt. And it then spent its time as a steamer there. And she was actually moved in 1839 to Lake Walen, or Walensee, and finished operating there in 1860. So this paddle steamer, Minerva, was actually built in Manchester by a company called William Fairbairn and Sons. And they built it, then they disassembled it to get it to Hull. It then went from Hull to Rotterdam, and then it went up the Rhine up as far as they could get it towards Lake Zurich. And then they disassembled it again so they could get it to Lake Zurich, where it was reassembled. So it was rather complicated, but apparently it had an iron hull. It was 98 foot long, and it was powered by a 40 horsepower steam engine. And there's several pictures of it, so I'll definitely post one of those up. But I'm pretty certain this is the one that William is seeing, because it would have been moved. It was moved in 1839 to Lake Walen. It had operated on Lake Zurich up until that time, but William says of this one, it was in dock for repairs at that time, but it would have been this one. I'm quite keen to look at the various transportation methods that William might have encountered, and also the technical and engineering things that he might have encountered on his travels at this time. She's quite a double-ended looking paddle steamer, so by that I mean the bow is quite similar to the stern. So it's kind of almost like a canoe-shaped thing, but with very large paddle steam wheels in the middle, obviously. That steamboat was all part of a company that later became the Lake Zurich Navigation Company, which is still in existence today. So its history of that company goes right back in various incarnations up until this day, because apparently the first steamer, which would have been Minerva, started on Lake Zurich in 1834. They currently have 17 passenger ships that ply Lake Zurich, and they have 2 paddle steamers that date back to the 1900s, 1909 and 1914, and actually they're built by a company that William later mentions in the journals, but I won't go into that now. There's the Stadt Zurich, which was built in 1909, and the Stadt Rapperswil, built in 1914. Having partaken of some refreshment, we again set forward by diligence, and pass through the town of Nefels, which is situated on the banks of the Linth, and it is defended by a castle picturesquely situated on the brow of an eminence overlooking the town. It is here that in the year 1388 a handful of Swiss, not exceeding 400 men, repulsed several thousand Austrians, led on by their leader Duke Leopold. In memory of this glorious action, a chapel was built on the spot, which was rebuilt as late as 1799. There's actually a memorial to this battle in Nefels there, which you can see. And this church, I'm not sure if it was actually built in memory of this battle. And the one that's there now is a rebuilt, or that William would have been looking at was a rebuilt chapel anyway. Nefels was a famous battle in Swiss history that dates back to medieval times. Just reading about it, it says here, the Battle of Nefels was fought on the 9th of April 1388 between the Swiss canton of Glarus, supported by allies of the Old Swiss Confederation, and the Duchy of Austria, ruled by the House of Habsburg. Now here it says, in this battle where the Swiss were heavily outnumbered by the Austrians, it's said that on the Swiss side 54 men were killed, but on the Austrian side it could have been as many as 1,700. So that gives you an idea of why it was seen as a great victory. Apparently it says here, the garrison comprising about 400 troops from Glarus and a few dozen troops from Schwitz and Uri held out for a short time, but were forced to withdraw into the hills. As they retreated, the Austrian army spread out to plunder the villages and farms. The Glarans then emerged from the snow and fog to take the Austrians by surprise, as they were preoccupied with looting. Following a brief battle, the disorganised Austrians broke and fled towards Wiesen, but the collapse of the bridge over the Marl or Weser Linth dropped much of their army into the river, where they drowned. In 1389, a 7 years' peace was signed at Vienna, leaving the Confederation in undisputed possession of all the territory it had acquired in the recent war. In the same year, the first Feldschaftsfahrt, a pilgrimage to the site of the battle, was held. This pilgrimage, which still occurs, happens on the first Thursday in April and is in memory of the battle. The pilgrimage played an important role in the creation of the united canton of Glarus. Arrived at Rapperswil in the canton of Zurich at 4 o'clock. This is a large and ancient town situated on a neck of land that advances into the Lake of Zurich, of which there is a wooden bridge 1,850 feet in length. The town contains some curious old buildings, the floors overhanging one another, the gables projecting into the streets, and covered with grotesque carvings in wood. I also noticed 2 or 3 ancient and quaintly decorated churches. Great numbers of people were in the streets in their holiday garb. They looked well and comfortably attired, and some were very fashionably dressed. Altogether, it reminded me strongly of some of the old cities and borough towns of England. From this place the road runs along the banks of the Lake Zurich, and we passed through the villages of Milan and Erlenbach. Nothing can exceed the softness and beautiful views on its banks. Charming villages, noble mansions, churches, farmhouses, gardens, orchards, all please the eye, or can administer to the wants or luxuries of man that are to be found on this charming spot. Before us we could see the purple grape, peaches, apricots, apples, melons, and vegetables of every description, horses, cattle, and sheep in abundance. The water teeming with the choicest fish, and its surface covered with waterfowl. This celebrated lake extends in the form of a crescent, chiefly through the canton of Zurich, but partly also between those of Schweitz and St. Gall. It is divided into the upper and lower waters by the Strait of Rapperswil. It is 30 miles in length, and from 1 to 5 in breadth. This lake, without rivaling those of Geneva or Lucerne in awful sublimity of scenery, is still one of the finest in Europe, being surrounded by a populous and well-cultivated country, and the prospects on its banks being richly varied. We arrived at Zurich at 8 in the evening. March 21st. This was a dreadful stormy day, snow, sleet and rain during the whole of it. I, however, managed to see a little of this beautiful city. Zurich is situated at the northern extremity of the lake, and is the capital of the canton of the same name. It occupies both sides of the rapid and transparent river Limmat, which issues from the lake and divides the city into 2 unequal parts, communicating by several bridges. Some are of wood, others of stone, which are elegant and substantial. Zurich is also particularly well lighted with elegant lamps and the oil of the purest character. Such was the brilliancy of the streets and bridges on the evening we arrived, that I settled in my own mind that the place was lighted with gas, until I discovered my mistake the next morning. It was formerly an imperial city, and is one of the best built in Switzerland. But in the old parts the streets are narrow and the houses high. Great and rapid improvements have taken place within the last few years. It contains a large but very plain cathedral and several churches, though none of them possess any great beauty. The Post and Diligence Office is a large, noble, and commodious building. The Hotel Baur directly opposite is one of the finest establishments of the kind I ever entered into, for comfort, accommodation, civility, and cheapness. It contains large or small apartments, a coffee and newsroom, and table d'hôte for guests. In short, everything that can be wished for or desired. Added to this, there is upwards of 20 waiters, who amongst them speak all the continental languages. On a traveller making his appearance, the porter, who himself is a master of 6 languages, immediately asks him what language he speaks, and having ascertained that point, immediately sends a waiter to him with whom he can converse at length. Okay, this is the final part of this section of the journal that I'm going to discuss. I just thought I'd mention a couple of things. The first thing is that as Will's travelling from Lake Walensee, they then end up in this town called Rapperswil. Again, all these can be said in French and German, but we'll stick with Rapperswil. William mentions this bridge which he goes over from one side of the lake to the other. This is Lake Zurich. So Lake Zurich has 2 sort of sections, the Obersee, which is a quite small section of lake, and then the much larger bit which ends up with Zurich at the end. And in between the two, it narrows due to glacial evolution, apparently. It gets very narrow at this point where Rapperswil is on one side and Herden, her village, is on the other. So got Herden on the south side and Rapperswil on the north side. Now, when William was travelling, this bridge was very ancient. He says it's 1,850 feet long, and the bridge that he was on dated right back to the 1300s. It was apparently built by Rudolf IV, who was an Austrian ruler amongst the Habsburgs of that area at the time, and it was under his instigation that this bridge be built. But it lasted all the way up until 1875, so that's the one that William is traversing in 1842. But what happened was, in 1875, they decided the wooden bridge really wasn't enough, so they built this thing called the Sea Dam, which is essentially almost like a constructed pathway on a much bigger scale. It's got 2 bridges on it, and those bridges, well, now they carry a road and a railway line as well. So the sea dam is what was put in place of this old bridge to kind of make the connection a much more practical one. And obviously it could then take bigger vehicles and things like that and more pedestrians over it than the old wooden bridge. But relatively recently, in the middle of the old wooden bridge was a tiny little chapel. I say middle, it's not really, it's more closer to the Rapperswil side of the lake. But it's a tiny little chapel, or bridge chapel, called Heliküsli. And this dates back to the 1400s, this little chapel. I mean, it's very small. I think you could probably only get about 3 people in it. But when the sea dam was built and the old bridge was demolished, this left this on this island on its own and no one could get access to it. So, I mean, I don't think this was the main reason they did it, but one of the reasons, in 2001, they decided to build a new wooden bridge, similar to the one that had been the medieval one, and reconnect this little chapel, and basically make a kind of an alternative way for pedestrians to cross this bit of Lake Zurich. But when William's travelling it, there was only this wooden bridge, and that would have been the main way of travelling from the south shore of the lake to the north shore. And then William continues his journey, as we hear, through the various villages on the lake's shore up to Zurich on the north side of the lake. Rapperswil itself, William mentions the interesting looking buildings with carvings. I've just seen a few pictures. It does look quite picturesque. I haven't seen so much carvings, but a lot of the buildings seem to have these sort of mosaic representations on their facades above the first floor and doorways. I'm sure you could look into more details. Rapperswil as a town goes back a long way, so 13th century and stuff. So there's quite a few historic buildings in that area. So you could, I'm sure, look up all the things about Rapperswil. The other thing that I wanted to mention is this hotel that William's very impressed by, which he calls the Hotel Baur. It's now called the Baur en Ville, or the Savoy Baur en Ville. It's still there, remarkably, and it's still a hotel. It's still a very posh hotel, and it was built by an Austrian gentleman called Johannes Baur. I think I'm saying that right. It's B-A-U-R. Anyway, he'd only opened it up a couple of years before William staying in it. He was originally a baker from Austria, but he moved to Zurich and lived there. And with his wife, they bought this building that I think they said had been a parsonage and converted it into a hotel, this posh hotel. It's renowned as the first hotel in Zurich. Apparently, when it first opened, it had 140 beds and stables for 36 to 40 horses. It's changed quite dramatically over the years. In William's time, it was just a 2-storey building. They added 2 more stories, I think, in about the 1870s. And actually, in the 1970s, the thing was almost completely gutted for safety reasons and fire hazard reasons, and they kept the facade, but the whole internal bit of it was almost completely rebuilt. But if you go there, you will still see in this bit of Zurich, in the Paradeplatz, I think it's called, the Savoy Baur en Ville, or the Hotel Baur, and that's the one that William's talking about, and where he had the great pleasure of being introduced to all these waiters who could speak numerous languages. So obviously I think Johannes Baur intended it to be a posh hotel, and apparently fairly notable people who stayed there at the time. Mendelssohn, the composer, stayed there, and going back to someone else we've talked about already, Franz Liszt stayed there. So, it was definitely a posh hotel at the time. In fact, Baur also opened a very posh hotel in 1844, which is actually on the shore of Lake Zurich. And that's called the Baur au Lac. And actually, when I first looked into that, I got this slightly confused because I thought it was that one that William was talking about. But it wasn't that one. It was this one in central Zurich, in the Paradeplatz, which is a square in downtown Zurich. Apparently, this is one of the most expensive pieces of real estate in Switzerland and has become synonymous with wealth and Swiss banks, being the location of the headquarters of both UBS and Credit Suisse. So, obviously, this hotel is in the poshest bit of Zurich, by the sounds of it. Don't think I'll be able to stay there myself, unfortunately. I'll be going to whatever the equivalent of the Zurich Premier Inn is. Anyway, William, I don't know if he actually stayed there. It just seems like he enjoyed a coffee and the papers and being waited on by these, what sounds like very attentive staff. Just thought it's quite amazing that this hotel is the oldest hotel in Zurich, and William was staying there in 1842, or was sitting in the foyer anyway, or in the restaurant, in the cafe, way back in 1842, and it hadn't been opened that long, and so it's only been opened for about, I think it's opened in 1838, so he's there about 4 years later. At least the location is still there. The hotel, they kept the sort of style of the original building, but they just added these floors to it. So I will show you the pictures of the original and how it is now. But you can sort of still see the kind of similarity there. I think William must have had a bit of brass, as I say, to be able to afford these various things that he's doing on his travels. He did enjoy the finer things in life when he could, I think. Right, that's the end of this 31st episode. This seemed a good place to stop while William is enjoying the delights of the Baur Hotel. I don't know whether he invited his family along to enjoy it too. I sometimes feel they get treated a little bit like an afterthought by William. Perhaps I'm being a bit harsh there. Anyway, it was quite an interesting episode, going up through Switzerland, following the lakes and the rivers. And I imagine at this time this was the main route he would go through Switzerland to get up to the north and into Baden, which would now be the German border. The next episode will continue their journey going along this route up into Germany, and then they proceed on their way to Ostend from there. Anyway, if you're enjoying the podcast so far, do tune in again for the next episode. And as I've mentioned, you can contact me through those social media ways, Twitter, Facebook, etc. I'm happy to be picked up on my historical inaccuracies as well. As I've mentioned, I have to do quite a lot of paraphrasing of the history, so sometimes in doing that, I think my generalisations and things can be a bit careless, I think might be the word to say. As usual as well, do subscribe to the podcast, do tell your friends and family. Anyway, that is it for episode 31. I hope to get on to episode 32 ASAP, although there might be a bit of a gap as I've got quite a few work commitments coming up at the moment, so that might slow things down just a tad. But do give me any feedback if you'd like to, and once again, if you have been, thanks for listening.